Hey guys, Pedro here to tell you about the latest from Untitled Decapitation, Terrasite, out May 12th on Metal Blade Records. This album has 10 tracks, 53 minutes in length, and this is the band's 8th full-length studio album. They are an American death metal band. When you look at the design of this record, when you look at the overall construction of the album, you're almost forced to look back at Death Atlas. Both albums are two different sides of the same coin. One is death and darkness, the other one is light and rebirth. They don't just have this sense of theme in common between them. They also have a very similar design. This is an album that offers incredible quality as far as the individual songs are concerned. You can remove them from the context of the album, you're still going to feel exactly what the songs are all about, in the sound, in the lyrics, in the experience. When you put them back into the context of the record, you're going to find an album that's very well connected, that it's easy to connect the dots from song to song, it's easy to grow with it, and allows the album to have an incredible experience all around. Very fluid, very dynamic, very engaging. All of these individual characteristics tied in with the global perspective of building an album gives this record outstanding playability. It never gets bored, it never gets tiring, because it's one of those records that you discover almost something new every time you press play, every time you go through it. As far as the sound is concerned, this record is different from its predecessor. Like I said before, it's brighter, it's rebirth, it's more melodic, but it's also a lot thicker in the sound and a lot more dense. Now, the melody side of the sound is important because you can create a sinister vibe, not necessarily a dark vibe, with that same melody. That melody could represent rebirth, that melody could represent something that you're unsure of, something uneasy. Think about a horror movie, for example. The previous album was more about going into the basement, into a dark corner, not knowing what's there that could harm you. This one puts everything right in front of you. It doesn't hide it. It's in plain sight. So the melodic sound of the album gives you that sinister vibe right in front of you. You're not guessing. You can see it. That is definitely one of the biggest changes between both records. But then just because the album has a lot more melody in it, just because the album allows you to feel like there is a lot more brightness in it, it doesn't mean it's not heavy. I actually feel like this is a heavier album than its predecessor because the heaviness of this record feels more condensed. Like I said, this is a very thick, a very dense sounding album. And now here's where the production comes into play. Normally when you have albums that depend on volume, on how dense and thick they are, in order to give you a sense of heaviness, the lines become blurred. It's very difficult to tell what's doing what, what's causing what. This album doesn't have that problem because the production behind it is outstanding. You can still hear the drums and the definition that they have. You can hear the bass, the definition that it has, and then you can see what the guitars are doing with their duality of movements, almost like always having two different highways, one for each guitar. This gives the sound a sense of purpose. This gives the sound a sense of direction. This is a very driven album from that point of view. The sound is powerful. The sound is epic. This is as close as you'll get to an epic death metal record, if that's even a thing, because it feels grandiose. The sound on this album is not just dense, it's not just thick, it's not just heavy and brutal, but it's also really big. The melodic side of the album, the melodic side of the sound, thins out the edges of that density, the edges of that thickness, allowing the overall footprint of the soundscape to be a lot bigger than what you normally get from an album that's very condensed, that has a lot of heaviness in it. So it's an album that almost feels like it's expanding and contrasting, not just from song to song, but within songs themselves. A really interesting dynamic that gives a lot of life to the soundscape, that gives a lot of life to these songs. Then when you look at the individual elements, you look at the bass, for example, the bass really pops on this record. It's noticeable. And I felt like the bass on this album helps with that sense of density, because it's important to create thickness, and that's where the drums and the chunkier side of the guitar sound comes into play. But in order to create a dense sound experience or a dense atmosphere, the bass plays an important role if it's mixed well and if it's put almost as a layer that allows the other elements to be better connected. And that's exactly what you're going to find on this record. The drums are powerful. The drums are outstanding on this album. They have a sense of strength. They also have this ability to become the backbone of not just the heaviness, but the overall sense of epicness that the sound puts forward. The drums are just phenomenal. I really enjoyed the quality that they have, how thick they sounded, how textured they sounded, how warm they sounded. They honestly had a sense of spring to them, like there was a warm feel in the air, but it was a powerful and thunderous feeling at the exact same time. The guitars, like I said earlier, they have a very diverse experience. If you look at the elements sound-wise that this album offers, the diversity sound-wise that this album offers, a lot of the times are driven by the guitar experience and what they put forward. This is an album that brings in almost all the subgenres of death metal under one single umbrella. And that allows them to have more tools to play with and not be defined just by one style, just by one approach, just by one influence. This also makes the experience a lot more dynamic. This also gives more life to the record, and it gives more life to the individual songs. Vocally, this album was surprising. Perhaps one of the things that I was surprised the most, because I was expecting the album to be more dynamic. I was expecting the ebbs and flows, the peaks and valleys vocally to be more defined, perhaps a little bit more in your face as well. And what I got from this record is an album that most of the time stays grounded. It uses the heavy, harsh vocals, the ones that come from a deeper place, and this balances out the overall experience that the album has. It makes the record feel more complete. It helps the overall sound also feel more complete, because like I said, this is an album that has volume. This is an album that sounds very dense. So when you're infusing heavy vocals that add to that density, that add to that volume, it just merges really well with everything else that is happening. So nothing feels out of place. Everything feels like it's fitting in just perfectly in order for all of these small pieces of the puzzle to come together so you can see the big picture. Now, when the upper side of the range comes in, when more of the screaming vocals come in, the clean vocals come in, when all of those elements are added to the overall vocal performance on this record, they add a lot of life. They add a lot of spice. And on the brighter moments, those vocals really help define that brightness. They also help define that sinister atmosphere that exists within this album from start to finish. And they also help thin out a little bit of the edges of the tracks, the edges of that epic sound experience, of that big volume, making the tracks feel at times slightly thinner within portions of the songs. This is important as well. It makes the album a lot easier to digest. It's not an album that overburdens the listener, that gives you too much to have at the same time. Those pockets within songs allow you to take almost a break, allow you to put your guard down and understand the song a little bit better, digest the lyrical content a little bit better, understand the mood of the track and where the track is taking you. So while being an album that is not as crazy vocally, that is not as dynamic with constant changes up and down, is an album that uses the vocals as a pure instrument in order to add to the overall sound design that they had for this record. Bringing both together gives incredible quality to the overall album. This record is another masterpiece by Cattle Decapitation. An album that just showcases how talented they are, not just as musicians, but as artists that have a vision for what they want. And that vision comes across in the artwork and the concept of the record, and how intelligent the lyrical content is in the song titles. Everything has a purpose. Nothing happened by accident on this album. Everything has a predetermined idea behind it, a concept behind it that it's pushing it, that's driving, and every single piece needs to be where it is in order, like I said, for those pieces of the puzzle to coming together and you be able to see exactly what this album offers. Another great record by Cattle Decapitation. As far as favorite songs are concerned, I want to start off with And the World Will Go On Without You. I love the intro of this track, but that's not the reason why I really love this song. It's a track that allows you to take baby steps until it gets really meaty. And the drum sound on this track is definitely meaty. Now the guitars add layers, and those layers add another experience to what the song puts forward. They add heaviness, but also a more direct and subtle melodic drive to the overall track, similar to what the vocals are doing from beginning to end. It's an album that has, lower, heavier moments, and then higher, more spread out moments. The vocals are dynamic, but they stay grounded for the majority of the song. They're heavy and they bring the track down. That doesn't mean they stay there all the time, but that's where they stay for most of the time. And just because they're there, it doesn't mean that they don't add movement to the experience, because they do. Injecting the screams or the screaming style vocals definitely creates some ripples within this song. And the chorus is a perfect example of how melodic this track gets. When you get into that chorus and you feel the sound and you hear the vocals changing completely, like 180 from where everything else was up until that point, you're able to see the impact that that specific portion of the song has. It's almost becoming an exclamation mark on what the message of the track is all about. It's also infusing light into a song that up until that point was just very thick for you to even be able to see it. Next we have Dead in Residence. This is a pulsating song. Not all the time, but most of the time. That's pretty much the backbone of this song. It's coming in waves like the tide of the ocean. It's just coming in and going out, coming in and going out. And the drum sound is the main architect of that experience. Now, it's a drum sound that's really interesting because it really feels pulsating. It really gives a pulse. It gives a heartbeat to this song, but it's not consistent. That heartbeat is not consistent. There are flat out moments that there's no heartbeat whatsoever. It just becomes a little bit more layered. It becomes a little bit bigger. It becomes a much larger song volume-wise and even vocally, and how all those elements come together as one. A track that's made up of 3 different moments. That pulse, that heartbeat, then there is this dense, heavy, thick sound experience, and then the melodic side of the track that brings that sinister atmosphere into the forefront. When you build a track that has 3 different parts, and those 3 different parts, while being very different from one another, are perfectly integrated, you create a song that's so dynamic, that's so engaging, that feels like it's pulling you in 1,000 different directions. Last but not least, Solastalgia. This is, without a shadow of a doubt, my favorite song on the album. This is epic death metal at its best. I don't know if that's a genre, but this song would definitely be the song that would define it as such. It's a jaw-dropping track, both musically and vocally. First of all, the drums are phenomenal. Talk about heaviness, talk about pounding, talk about being powerful. The drums are all of that on this song. The bass really pops. They give so much room to the bass in this song. Not just for you to experience it in the layers of the track, but they actually allow the bass to come into the forefront and have its own 15 seconds of fame. And then you have guitars that are filled with energy, that are moving in a very fluid way. On top of all of this, you have a very vocally dynamic song, perhaps one of the most vocally dynamic songs on this record. The closing portion of this track is pure epicness, musically and vocally. But the vocals that end this song, they take you into a whole different place, surrounded by the sound, the more melodic approach. The ending of this track is just pure bliss. It almost becomes a soundtrack material, a death metal soundtrack to a sci-fi movie. That is the end, because the song changes completely, becomes super melodic, it becomes super thin, easy to digest, easy to understand, easy to grasp, very beautiful, very epic. The sound is not big, but it feels big because of the impact of that melody. And then you have the changing vocal styles that brings that more screaming vocals, but they're easy to decipher, they're easy to understand. They come from a different place. They come almost from a place of simplicity. And when you add that vocal approach to the way the sound is and the way the sound is coming across, it's an ending for the ages. You honestly feel like you're watching a sci-fi movie, and this is that soundtrack that's setting up a cliffhanger in the overall story and the overall arch of the story of that movie that you're watching. Absolutely phenomenal track, a track that takes you on a path, that takes you on a journey, and then it finishes off with an exclamation mark. Exactly what you wanted from a track like this. This is it, Cattle Decapitation with Terrasite, out May 12th on Metal Blade Records. Let me know your thoughts on the band, on the singles. use the comment section below. I'll be reading those and getting back to you. Take care, guys.